Welcome to the Rev and the Rav, a program of interreligious dialogue and discovery. My name is Rabbi Daniel Lehmann, president of Hebrew College.
And I'm Nick Carter, president of Andover Newton Theological School. Welcome.
So Nick, the Torah reading over last week and the coming weeks deals with the details of the construction of the tabernacle in the desert. As the Jews wander and are given the commandment in the book of Exodus to build this sacred space for God's indwelling among the people. And it raises for me the question of how we in our religious traditions think about sacred space. And I was particularly curious about the notion of sacred space as it gets expressed in Protestant Christianity, and most particularly, for instance, in Andover Newton's Wilson Chapel. I've been there many times for all kinds of different programs, religious and not so religious, and it's always struck me the way that space was designed and conceived, and what makes it sacred. Is it sacred? What were the kind of models for the development of that space? Because here was an opportunity not that long ago. I don't know how old it is.
We built it in 2007.
Right. So here's a 21st century chapel.
Right.
And how did Andover Newton conceive of what that would look like, and what's the religious meaning behind the way it was designed?
Sure. It was a fascinating process. We'd always envisioned that there would be a chapel on our campus, and we had one that was really a converted library, and we had the opportunity to build one, and rarely do you get those chances to start from scratch. So we sat and turned to the faculty first, and we said, look, if our primary traditions are Congregational, UCC, and Baptist, to a degree more so now Unitarians, but one of the things they all have in common is the New England Meeting House. And it really is one of the iconic symbols of our traditions, right from the Puritans right straight through. And we asked our faculty, if we were to build the New England Meeting House in the 21st century, what would it look like? And they appropriately went back first to the theology that was behind it, and tried to then embody that in this new building. The first and most critical principle is that the congregation makes the church, not the building. And so for the New England Meeting House, when the congregation wasn't there, it was just a building. And therefore it could be used for public meetings, for art, for political debates, all sorts of things. When the congregation came, it became a sacred space.
Okay, so let me push a little bit on this, because this is interesting to me. So when the congregation, as a human group, designates space as being special for sacred purposes, we're going to celebrate our Sunday service here and not other places. We're going to come here regularly to pray, to sing, to commune with God. That doesn't therefore make that space, the space itself, sacred?
No. The sacredness comes with the gathering, with the fellowship, with the community. That for Christians, Jesus said, whenever 2 or 3 are gathered together, I am in the midst of them.
Right, it's interesting. Jews have this notion too, and in fact, when we bless after a meal, if there are 3 people present, there's a different blessing which invokes God in a communal way, even if it's done, in a picnic out in a park.
Yeah. Now, that's not to say, and there's another part of the Reformed tradition, which is another key root for us, that as part of the Reformation stood over against so many of the symbols. And it's one of the reasons why you see so many New England meeting houses are virtually free of icons.
Right, it's very plain.
Very plain. And so in the Wilson Chapel, there are no fixed images. There's not even a fixed cross.
Right.
It's just a space. Now, we have lots of crosses, but they're all movable. And as the chairs and things. Now,
so this is the origin of the multi-purpose room.
Yes, really. Yeah, and now there are subtle, important historical and faith traditions that are root there. The walls are made of Jerusalem limestone.
Interesting.
The space itself is almost within a cubit of the measurements of the inner sanctum of Solomon's temple.
Wow. So there are symbols.
It's very thoughtfully designed in the way it's put together.
I mean, you're nodding to religious space.
Yes.
That has historic, iconic significance.
And it has a tower.
Right.
Which New England meeting houses have a steeple that point Godward.
Right.
It has a soaring ceiling, inviting a sense of otherness, transcendence, and all those kinds of things, subtle. And in fact, while you don't recognize it immediately, there are 1,000 crosses in there of the way the patterns of the windows and things that are done. The walls themselves look a lot like the ceiling of the Parthenon. There's some very interesting kinds of choices. But for us, the movable symbols that we bring in, table. Table is not, for Protestants, it's much more of a table than an altar. Now, for different traditions who use it, sometimes that table will be pushed up against the wall and become an altar. And the orientation of the congregation changes. But now, we have a lot of that, Danny. But I note that there isn't a chapel here at Hebrew College. Could you explain this to me?
Well, first of all, I want to say...
Yet?
Well, I wasn't involved in the design and construction of this building.
But a great Jewish architect was.
Yes, although he's not known particularly for religious architecture. When I was involved in building a building for Gann Academy, the high school here in the Boston area, we actually created it's interesting, not a chapel, but a Beit Midrash. It was a house of study, which actually in Jewish law has higher sacred significance or sacred value than a synagogue. In other words, the tabernacle in the temple, that was really God's dwelling place. And even though the tabernacle, by the way, that we're reading about in these Torah portions was movable, and everything was movable. They all had, staves, and they were able to be carried.
Sort of a religious RV.
Right, exactly. Very much so. Yet, even though it was movable and moved with the people of Israel, once that space was erected, even temporarily, that inner sanctum that you refer to, which existed in the tabernacle as well, becomes holy. And only only the priests could go into the inner sanctum once a year. And the symbols were significant. You had the ark, you had the menorah, the candelabra, you had the showbread, you had the cherubim above the ark, you had the curtains with various symbols. It was highly symbol-oriented, much of which, by the way, we've lost. And from a Jewish law perspective, actually is traditionally prohibited, meaning you don't want to recreate the temple or the tabernacle because you want to emphasize the fact that we are bereft of that. But obviously a lot of those symbols carried over anyway. But here at Hebrew College, they did not build a chapel or even a Beit Midrash. We use a room now for a Beit Midrash for the rabbinical school, but that was really a library space. And I don't know whether that was just because this was the first phase of what they hoped would be other phases, but even in the models that I've seen of the other phases, there was an auditorium.
Right.
But not a chapel.
That was a big issue between us,
Correct. And I think part of that was the history of Hebrew College as a more secular institution, as more culturally focused. And the rabbinical school really came after the design and construction of this building. So that more secular past was being preserved in the building, and Hebrew College never saw itself as competing with or paralleling synagogues or sacred spaces. Yeah. So really this was more of a secular space.
It's an interesting question, because we try and be clear that Wilson Chapel is not a church. It's a place where our community comes together to worship, but it's also a teaching space. Right. We're training ministers there how to preach and how to lead services and things. And we don't see ourselves as competing. We don't have Sunday morning services in Wilson Chapel. But, you know, there is a fascinating question about sacred space, because it begs also the relationship between Protestants and Catholics and Greek Orthodox, where sacred space is a much more present reality with sacred symbols, signs, and spaces.
Which is more of a continuation of the tabernacle and temple.
Yes,
it's really much more consistent with that.
Much more so.
And the Protestants are making a break from that emphasis on the physical.
By definition, the Protestants broke from that. Interestingly, now they're starting to drift back. And there is a growing sense of holy envy of some of those spaces. And it's fascinating to watch Protestants as they observe Roman Catholic services, Greek Orthodox services, Jewish services, of what creates a sacred space, what makes it sacred, and is there a particular blessing to an object, and does that object carry some spirituality to it? It's a very interesting question.
It's interesting. There's actually even a notion in Judaism, in traditional Judaism, that you don't typically have funerals in synagogues. Because synagogues are sacred, and in tabernacle and temple times, if you had contact with the dead, you weren't allowed in the temple precincts, because the temple sacred area was life-affirming. It was the space of God, the source of life, and death, human death, was not to encroach. And so in synagogues, traditionally, you don't have funerals, except for rabbis or great leaders or that kind of thing, because you respect the sacredness of the space, which is kind of anti-death, which is interesting.
You and I we ought to have a whole session on funerals and death. Stay tuned for that, folks. Certainly amongst Baptists, there is a tradition that you don't have a funeral in the church.
So
you have a memorial service.
Right. And the funerals at the
graveside? Well, you can do something at the funeral parlor and at the graveside. Right. But it puts too much emphasis on the body rather than on the spirit. Now, across the spectrum of Protestantism and Catholicism, that changes dramatically, and folks look to do that as a sort of final blessing that goes. Right. Well, folks, we could go on here, but this has been fun to talk about this a little bit. I want to thank you for joining us for the Rev and the Rav today. I am Reverend Nick Carter, president of Andover Newton Theological School. Peace.
And I'm Daniel Lehmann from Hebrew College. Shalom.